It was a bright and sunny day when Emma stepped into the elevator, ready to head up to her apartment on the 20th floor. As she pressed the button, the doors slid shut with a soft ding, and she felt the elevator begin its ascent. But something felt off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it at first, but as the elevator rose higher and higher, she felt a growing sense of unease. The air grew colder, and she heard a strange humming sound that made her hair stand on end. She pressed the emergency button, but there was no response. It was as if the elevator had become its own self-contained world, cut off from the rest of the building. Suddenly, the elevator jolted to a stop, and Emma felt her stomach drop as the lights went out completely. For a moment, she was plunged into darkness, and she could hear nothing but her own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, she began to feel something else in the darkness with her. It was a cold presence, a feeling of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She tried to push it away, to tell herself it was just her imagination, but it was no use. The feeling only grew stronger, until it was a physical weight on her chest. As the minutes ticked by, Emma tried everything she could think of to get the elevator moving again. She pounded on the doors, she screamed for help, she even tried to pry open the ceiling hatch. But nothing worked. The elevator was stuck, and she was trapped. As the hours dragged on, Emma's sense of panic grew. She tried to distract herself by thinking about happier times, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw terrible images flicker across her mind. She saw herself suffocating, drowning, being burned alive. Each image was more horrifying than the last, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow coming from the elevator itself. By the time the sun set, Emma was a wreck. Her clothes were soaked with sweat, her eyes were bloodshot, and she was shaking from head to toe. She knew that she had to get out of the elevator, but she didn't know how. It wasn't until the elevator doors finally opened, nearly 24 hours after she had stepped inside, that Emma realized the true horror of her situation. The elevator had been stuck in the middle of a deserted building, and she had been trapped in a tiny, airless space with no food, no water, and no way to escape. As she stumbled out of the elevator and collapsed onto the floor, Emma knew that she would never be the same again. She had been through a nightmare that no one should ever have to experience, and she knew that the memories would haunt her for the rest of her life. The night was dark and rainy as Sarah drove home from her friend's house. She had been looking forward to a cozy evening at home, but her car skidded on the wet road and she lost control. The car spun out of control, and Sarah felt her world turn upside down as the car crashed through the guardrail and plummeted into the icy river below. As the car sank deeper and deeper into the water, Sarah fought to stay conscious. She knew she had to get out of the car before it was too late, but her seatbelt was jammed and the doors were stuck. Panic rose in her chest as the water rushed in, and she felt herself being pulled down into the murky depths. But just as she thought all hope was lost, Sarah felt something tug on her arm. It was a man, a stranger who had seen the accident and dove into the water to try and help. With his help, Sarah managed to free herself from the seatbelt and scramble out of the car, gasping for air as she clung to the stranger's arm. But as they swam towards the surface, Sarah felt something brush against her leg. It was cold and slimy, and she couldn't see what it was in the darkness. Panic surged through her again, and she felt herself being pulled down once more. The stranger pulled her closer, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes too. Together, they kicked and struggled towards the surface, fighting against the current and the weight of their waterlogged clothes. But just as they broke through the surface, Sarah felt something wrap around her ankle. It was a vine, a tangle of seaweed that had been stirred up by the accident. It was dragging her back down. Sarah screamed, and the stranger dove back down to help her. He pulled at the vine, tearing it away from her leg with brute force. Together they swam towards the riverbank, gasping for air and shaking with fear. As they stumbled out of the water and onto the muddy bank, Sarah realized that she had narrowly escaped death. She looked back at the river, at the car sinking slowly into the darkness, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that she would never be able to forget the terror of being trapped underwater, of feeling the cold, slimy embrace of the unknown pulling her down. And she knew that she would never take life for granted again. It was a quiet and lonely night shift at the meatpacking factory. Jake was the only employee on duty, tasked with monitoring the freezers and ensuring that everything was in order. It was a tedious job, but Jake didn't mind. He had worked at the factory for years, and he knew the ins and outs of the place like the back of his hand. But as the night wore on, something strange began to happen. The lights in the freezer flickered, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He tried to brush it off as just his imagination, but as he checked the temperature gauges, he saw that they were steadily dropping. It was as if the freezer was alive, and it was trying to freeze him out. Suddenly, the door to the freezer slammed shut, and Jake heard the lock click into place. Panic surged through him as he realized that he was trapped inside. He pounded on the door, screamed for help, but no one answered. It was as if he was the only person in the world. As the minutes ticked by, Jake felt the cold seeping into his bones. He tried to keep moving, to keep his blood flowing, but it was no use. The freezer was too cold, and he was too exposed. He could feel his limbs growing numb, and he knew that he was running out of time. But just as he was about to give up hope, he heard something stirring in the darkness. It was a whisper, a low and raspy voice that seemed to come from all around him. It was like nothing he had ever heard before, and it made his blood run cold. As the voice grew louder, Jake felt a presence looming over him. He couldn't see anything in the darkness, but he could feel the cold breath on his neck, the clammy fingers wrapping around his arms. He tried to pull away, to fight back, but it was no use. The presence was too strong, too overpowering. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. Jake was left alone in the freezer, trembling and terrified. He knew that he had narrowly escaped something far worse than death, and he knew that he could never go back to that factory again. As the sun rose and the shift ended, Jake stumbled out of the freezer and collapsed onto the floor. He knew that he would never be the same again, that he would always carry the memory of being trapped in the freezer, of feeling the icy grip of the unknown closing in around him, and he knew that he would never forget the haunting voice that had whispered in his ear, promising him a fate far worse than death. It was a typical Monday afternoon, and George was tasked with organizing the storage room at his new job. He had only been working at the hardware store for a week, but he wanted to make a good impression on his boss. As he made his way through the shelves and boxes, he suddenly felt the door slam shut behind him. The lock clicked into place, and he was plunged into complete darkness. At first, George tried to remain calm. He figured it was just a mistake, and someone would come back for him soon. But as the minutes turned into hours, he began to panic. The darkness was overwhelming, and he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. The silence was deafening, and he felt completely alone. George tried to call for help, but his voice was weak and shaky. He tried to find his way around the storage room, but he kept bumping into shelves and tripping over boxes. The room seemed to shift and change around him, and he couldn't make sense of where he was or what was happening. As the hours turned into days, George's fear turned to desperation. He was running out of food and water, and he had no idea how long he had been trapped in the storage room. He started to hallucinate, seeing strange shapes and hearing disembodied voices in the darkness. But then, something else started to happen. George started to feel a presence in the room with him. It was cold and malevolent, and he could feel it watching him from the shadows. It seemed to be getting closer, creeping towards him with each passing moment. George tried to fight back, to ward off the presence, but it was too strong. It enveloped him, suffocating him in its cold embrace. He could feel it clawing at his skin, pulling him deeper and deeper into the darkness. When George was finally found, days later, he was a shell of his former self. He had been trapped in the storage room for nearly a week, and the experience had left him traumatized. He could never forget the terror of being trapped in the darkness, of feeling the presence of something unseen and malevolent. And he knew that he would never be the same again.